Few names commanded more respect in the American West during the tumultuous years following the Civil War than Samuel Ghost Shot Reynolds, a man whose very presence could silence a rowdy saloon, whose accuracy with a Colt .45 became the stuff of legend, and whose signature silver-plated revolvers were said to have claimed the lives of 37 of the deadliest outlaws across 3 territories. But that was before he vanished, before the whispers of his death spread through frontier towns like wildfire, and before he chose the quiet life of a rancher in a forgotten corner of the Colorado Territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Join me today as we uncover the extraordinary tale of the man they called Ghost Shot, who proved that the deadliest weapon isn't the fastest draw or the loudest voice, but the quiet resolve of a man who's made peace with his past. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. Whisper Creek, Colorado Territory, spring of 1878. Like countless other settlements scattered across the untamed frontier, it was a place where hope and hardship danced an endless waltz beneath the shadow of the Rockies. But unlike the booming silver towns or the cattle-driving hubs that dotted the territory, Whisper Creek had remained remarkably untouched by the violence that plagued its neighbors. Perhaps it was the town's isolation, tucked away in a hidden valley where the winter winds whispered secrets to the pines, or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that would soon become clear to those who dared disturb its peace. The town itself was a modest collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around the stage route like wildflowers after spring rain. The main street, little more than a wide dirt track, was flanked by essential establishments that marked any frontier settlement: the general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office, and the telegraph station. Behind these, small houses and workshops sprawled outward, their wooden frames weathered by the harsh Colorado elements but standing proud against the mountain backdrop. On a crisp April morning, as dawn painted the mountain peaks in hues of amber and gold, a lone rider appeared on the eastern trail. He sat straight in his saddle, despite the obvious weariness of his journey, leading a pack mule laden with farming equipment. Those few souls awake at that early hour would later recall 2 distinctive features about the stranger: the well-worn cavalry coat that hung from his broad shoulders, and the pair of pristine silver-plated Colts that rode low on his hips, their pearl handles yellowed with age but maintained with religious devotion. Isabella Bell Ramirez, whose general store served as the town's unofficial gathering place, watched the stranger dismount with the fluid grace of a mountain lion. There was something about him, she would later tell the town's newspaper, something in the way he moved, like a man who'd spent years ensuring every gesture served a purpose, every step calculated, every movement precise. The store's bell chimed softly as he entered, his spurs singing a quiet song against the wooden floor, as he gathered basic supplies: coffee, ammunition, and surprisingly, a packet of peppermint candies. The stranger made his way to Sheriff Daniel Steel Hand Morrison's office, his spurs singing a soft melody against the wooden boardwalk. Morrison, a veteran of both Gettysburg and the Indian Wars, prided himself on being able to read men like wanted posters. But something about this newcomer gave him pause. The way he carried himself, the careful positioning that kept his back to the wall and his eyes on every entrance, these weren't the habits of a simple farmer looking for a fresh start. "Name's Samuel Reynolds," the stranger said, his voice as soft as prairie grass in the wind. "Heard there might be land for sale out near Thunder Ridge." The sheriff couldn't help but notice how the man's calloused hands never strayed far from those silver Colts, even as he discussed acre prices and water rights. Morrison had seen his share of gunfighters and peacekeepers, but Reynolds was different. There was no bravado in his manner, no attempt to intimidate or impress. Instead, there was a stillness about him, like the calm before a storm. Noah. Ace Parker's saloon fell silent when Reynolds entered that evening, not with the sudden hush of fear, but with the gradual quieting of men who instinctively recognized a predator in their midst. The saloon, usually bustling with the rough music of frontier life, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, the boisterous laughter of cowboys and miners, seemed to hold its breath. He ordered whiskey but barely touched it, those storm-gray eyes continuously scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned the hard way about letting their guard down. It was Catherine "Kit" Morgan, running the telegraph office with an efficiency that would put military quartermasters to shame, who first began to piece together the puzzle. The stranger's name had stirred something in her memory, a half-remembered story from her days working the wire in Dodge City. "Ghost shot Reynolds," she whispered to herself, remembering the tales of a legendary lawman who could put a bullet through a man's gun hand at 50 paces without drawing blood, who'd brought justice to the lawless territories not through violence, but through an almost supernatural precision that left men disarmed and alive to face the judge's gavel. The tales spoke of a man who could shoot the flame off a candle without disturbing the wick, who once disarmed 7 men in the time it took a dropped coin to hit the dirt. But those were just stories. Myths spun around saloon fires on cold nights. The real ghost shot Reynolds had vanished years ago. Some said killed in a Mexican border town. Others claimed he'd hung up his guns and vanished into the vast emptiness of the frontier. Yet here was a man with silver Colts and eyes that had seen too much, seeking nothing more than a quiet piece of land in a forgotten valley. What no one in Whisper Creek realized, not yet, was that their peaceful corner of the Colorado Territory had drawn the attention of men whose appetite for power and violence would soon shatter their tranquil existence. The Shadow Riders, led by the notorious Jackson Black Jack Thorne and his brothers, had been watching the town from afar, seeing it as ripe territory for expansion. They had no way of knowing that the quiet man they would soon mock was the very legend whose name once made outlaws tremble, and whose silver Colts had never failed to find their mark. The stage was set, and Whisper Creek was about to learn why some legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. Within days of Samuel Reynolds' arrival, subtle changes began rippling through Whisper Creek like wind through tall grass. The stranger had purchased the old Henderson place, a sprawling ranch that had lain fallow since its previous owner disappeared during the harsh winter of '77. The property sat in a strategic location, nestled against Thunder Ridge where the valley narrowed, offering clear views of both the town and the main trail from the north. If you're finding this story engaging, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got more tales of frontier justice coming your way. What caught Dr. Eleanor Wright's attention wasn't just how Reynolds worked the land, though she had to admit there was something impressive about how he single-handedly began transforming the neglected ranch. No, it was the methodical way he studied every aspect of his surroundings, like a chess master analyzing the board before making his first move. She'd spent enough time treating veterans to recognize the signs of a man who'd learned the hard way about the importance of knowing every detail of his environment. "He's mapped every line of sight," she confided to Sheriff Morrison one evening as they watched Reynolds repair his fence line. "Every approach, every shadow, every place where a man might hide. I've treated my share of retired soldiers, Daniel, and that man moves like someone who spent years making sure he's never caught off guard. Look at how he positions himself, always with cover nearby, always with a clear path of retreat." The sheriff had noticed, too, the way Reynolds had positioned his new barn, the careful arrangement of mirrors in his windows that caught the sunlight in ways that illuminated blind spots, the strategic placement of wind chimes that would sound at the slightest disturbance. These weren't the preparations of a simple rancher. They were the calculated defenses of a man who knew trouble would eventually find him. 20 years wearing a badge, Morrison told Dr. Wright, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Man's turned that whole ranch into one big early warning system. Question is, what kind of trouble is he expecting? Nathan Hawk Harrison, the former cavalry scout who ran the livery stable, contributed his own observations to the growing mystery. "Watched him practice the other morning," he told the regular crowd at Parker's saloon, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Never seen anything like it. Man can put 6 shots through the same hole at 30 paces, and I swear I never saw him draw. It's like the gun just appears in his hand, like some kind of magic trick. Harrison paused, taking a thoughtful sip before continuing. But it's not just the speed or accuracy that's unsettling. It's the way he practices. Same time every morning, same number of shots, same methodical precision. And those silver Colts, I have seen my share of fancy guns, but these are different. They're not for show. They're tools, maintained with the kind of care most men reserve for precious heirlooms. The tales of Reynolds' shooting prowess spread through town like wildfire, though few had actually witnessed it themselves. Some claimed they'd seen him shoot a rattlesnake's head off without disturbing its rattle. Others swore he could split a playing card edgewise at 20 paces. But what intrigued the townsfolk most was his silence. The man barely spoke above a whisper, yet every word carried the weight of mountains. Isabella Ramirez noticed how he always had a kind word for the children who visited her store, often sharing those peppermint candies he bought weekly. But she also saw how he positioned himself with his back to the wall, those storm-gray eyes constantly moving, watching, assessing. "He reminds me of my father's hunting cat," she told Catherine Morgan one afternoon. "Gentle with family, but always ready, always aware that danger could come at any moment." Catherine, for her part, had been doing some discreet investigating of her own. As the telegraph operator, she had connections across the territory, and the name Reynolds had sparked something in her memory. "There are stories," she whispered to Isabella, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Stories about a lawman they called Ghost Shot, who could disarm a man faster than lightning. Some say he died in a border town years ago, others say he just vanished. But the descriptions, they match our mysterious rancher." What the good people of Whisper Creek didn't know was that danger was indeed coming. 50 miles north, in a hidden canyon where the Shadow Riders had made their camp, Jackson Blackjack Thorne was planning his next move. The notorious outlaw had built his reputation on taking over peaceful towns like Whisper Creek, using a combination of violence and intimidation to establish his own private kingdom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Town's perfect," he told his brothers as they studied a crude map by firelight. "Isolated enough that help would take days to arrive, wealthy enough from the local ranches to make it worth your while, and far enough from the railroad that the territory marshal won't bother them much. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, we'll be too entrenched to drive out." Caleb Viper Thorne, running a whetstone along his favorite knife, smiled coldly. "What about this new rancher they're all whispering about? The one with the silver guns? Been hearing some strange tales from our scouts. Probably some has-been gunslinger trying to play farmer." Blackjack sneered, spitting into the fire. "We've dealt with his kind before. They're usually the first to break when real violence comes calling. All that fancy gun work doesn't mean much against 30 determined men." But Ezra, Phantom Thorne, the youngest and most observant of the brothers, wasn't so sure. He'd spent time scouting the town, watching Reynolds from afar. "There's something different about this one," he warned, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "The way he moves, the way he watches everything, reminds me of stories I heard down in Texas, about a lawman they called Ghost Shot, man who could put a bullet through your gun hand before you even cleared leather." Blackjack dismissed his brother's concerns with a wave. "Ghost Shot Reynolds is dead. Died years ago in a border town shootout. This is just some drifter using his reputation to scare simple folk. Besides, we got 30 riders. No one man, legend or not, can stand against those odds." The eldest Thorne brother didn't know it yet, but his dismissal of Reynolds would prove to be the biggest mistake of his life. For while the Shadow Riders plotted their takeover of Whisper Creek, Samuel Reynolds was preparing in his own quiet way. Each morning, as dawn painted the mountains gold, the sound of gunfire echoed from his ranch. 6 shots, always 6, each finding its mark with supernatural precision. Sheriff Morrison, hearing those shots from town, was reminded of something his old cavalry commander once told him. "The deadliest predators don't announce themselves with roars and growls. They strike in silence, and by the time you hear them, it's already too late. The peace of Whisper Creek hung by a thread, suspended between the quiet determination of a legend trying to escape his past and the violent ambitions of men who would soon learn why that legend had inspired so much fear. The storm was gathering, and soon the valley would echo with more than just the whispers of wind through pine needles. The first real glimpse of Reynolds' true nature came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Parker's saloon. The spring cattle drive season had brought a rowdy crew of drovers into Whisper Creek, their pockets full of pay and their minds clouded by cheap whiskey. Among them was a notorious troublemaker known as Rattler Ross, a man whose reputation for picking fights was matched only by his speed with a gun. If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There's plenty more where this came from. Reynolds had been sitting in his usual corner, nursing a cup of coffee while reading a worn copy of Shakespeare's Macbeth, an unusual choice that had already set tongues wagging. Rattler, deep in his cups and looking to make a name for himself, decided the quiet rancher would make an easy target. "Ain't that precious," Rattler sneered, swaggering over to Reynolds' table. "A cowboy who reads, bet them fancy silver guns are just for show too, ain't they, old-timer?" The saloon fell silent, the kind of silence that usually preceded violence in frontier towns. Reynolds didn't look up from his book, his voice barely above a whisper. "Best move along, son, your coffee's getting cold." The suggestion carried no threat, but something in his tone made several veteran gun hands edge away from the confrontation. "Son?" Rattler's face flushed red. "I ain't your son, old man, and I'm thinking maybe it's time someone taught you some respect." His hand dropped to his gun, but before his fingers could brush leather, something extraordinary happened. No one saw Reynolds draw. There was no dramatic flourish, no visible movement. One moment his hands were holding the book. The next, his right silver Colt seemed to materialize on the table, its barrel pointing unerringly at Rattler's chest. The gun looked almost alive in the afternoon light, like a sleeping serpent ready to strike. "Your next choice," Reynolds said softly, his storm-gray eyes finally meeting Rattler's. "We'll determine whether you leave here walking or crawling. Choose wisely." In that moment, those who watched closely saw something shift in Reynolds' gaze, a glimpse of the predator beneath the quiet exterior, the ghost of the legend he'd once been. Rattler, despite his reputation and the whiskey in his blood, was no fool. He'd faced his share of gunfighters, but something about Reynolds' deadly stillness told him this was different. This wasn't a man trying to prove himself. This was a force of nature wrapped in human form. "No offense meant," Rattler managed, backing away with his hands raised. "Just a misunderstanding is all." He left town that evening, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd seen death itself in those quiet eyes. The incident sparked a fresh wave of speculation about the mysterious rancher. Noah Parker, wiping down his bar later that night, shared his observations with Sheriff Morrison. "Never seen anything like it, Daniel. Wasn't just the speed, though Lord knows that was something supernatural. It was the control. Man could have killed Rattler 10 times over, but he chose to end it without a shot fired." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Reminds me of something I saw once back in '71. Was in Dead Horse Creek when Ghost shot Reynolds face down the Carter gang. Same kind of quiet confidence, same supernatural speed. But Ghost shot's been dead for years. Catherine Morgan, who'd witnessed the confrontation from her usual corner table, added another piece to the puzzle. Got a wire from my friend in Denver last week. Asked about any gunmen known for silver Colts. She mentioned a story from down Texas way, about a lawman who could shoot the flame off a candle at 20 paces. Man who moved so fast said he must be a ghost. Dr. Wright, tending to her evening rounds, had her own theory. Watched him when Rattler was pushing. His breathing never changed. His hand stayed steady. That's not just experience, that's the kind of control that comes from years of walking the line between life and death. The incident drew unwanted attention from beyond Whisper Creek's peaceful valley. Word spread through the territory's outlaw camps like wildfire. A gunman of extraordinary skill had surfaced in the quiet town. Some dismissed it as frontier exaggeration, but others, particularly the Shadow Riders, saw an opportunity. "Perfect," Blackjack Thorne grinned when his scout brought the news. Man's shown his hand too early. Now we know what we're dealing with. Just another gunslinger past his prime, trying to hold on to his reputation. But his brother Ezra wasn't so sure. Stories say he didn't even draw against Rattler, just had the gun there like magic. That's not normal, Jack. That's not natural. Natural or not, Caleb interjected, no man can stand against 30 guns, doesn't matter how fast he is. Time we reminded these peaceful folks what real power looks like. What none of the Thorns realized was that the incident with Rattler had been more than just a show of force. It was a statement of intent. Samuel Reynolds hadn't come to Whisper Creek looking for trouble, but he'd just demonstrated with crystal clarity that he was more than capable of handling it when it came. As the sun set behind Thunder Ridge that evening, casting long shadows across the valley, Reynolds sat on his porch cleaning those silver colts with methodical precision. Each movement was practiced, perfect. The actions of a man who'd spent countless hours ensuring his tools of trade were ready at a moment's notice. The calm before the storm had passed. The legend of Ghost Shot was about to be reborn in blood and gunsmoke, and Whisper Creek would never be the same. Life in Whisper Creek settled into an uneasy rhythm following the incident with Rattler Ross. Samuel Reynolds established a routine as predictable as the sunrise, yet something about its precision sent shivers down the spines of those who watched closely. Every morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the mountains gold, 6 shots would echo from his ranch. Every Wednesday, precisely at 9, he'd arrive at Isabella's store for supplies. Every evening, just before sunset, he'd ride the boundaries of his property, those silver colts catching the dying light. If this story's got you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe. There's more frontier justice heading your way. Nathan Harrison, observing from his livery stable, noticed how Reynolds always checked his horses twice, once for general health and once for signs of strangers approaching them. Man treats everything like it's sending him messages, he told Sheriff Morrison. Way he reads tracks, studies broken twigs, even the way birds fly. It's like the whole valley's talking to him. The sheriff had seen his share of cautious men, but Reynolds took awareness to an entirely new level. Watched him during the town meeting last week, Morrison shared with Harrison. Had 3 different escape routes planned before he even sat down. Knew exactly where every person was, every weapon in the room. Kind of awareness that comes from surviving situations where others didn't. Dr. Wright found herself fascinated by the contradictions in Reynolds' character. She'd watch him spend hours teaching young Tommy Chen, the laundry owner's son, how to read from that worn copy of Shakespeare. Yet even during these gentle moments, his right hand never strayed far from his gun, and his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. It's like watching 2 men occupy the same space, she confided to Catherine Morgan over tea. One's a cultured gentleman who quotes poetry and gives candy to children. The other, something else entirely. Something that makes hardened killers like Rattler Ross turn tail and run. Catherine had been keeping her own careful records. His telegram patterns are interesting, she mused, sorting through her logs. Sends one every Friday to different offices across the territory. Denver, Dodge City, even as far as Texas. Always in code, always the same length, like he's maintaining some kind of network. The town's children adored him, clustering around whenever he visited Isabella's store. He always had those peppermint candies ready, along with stories about far-off places and gentle lessons about respect and honor. But even they sensed something different about him, the way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, head tilted slightly, listening to something only he could hear. Noah Parker noticed how Reynolds would position himself in the saloon, always in the corner back to the wall with clear lines of sight to every entrance. Man doesn't drink, not really, he told his regular customers. Orders whiskey, barely touches it. But those eyes, they see everything. Caught him watching a fight before it even started last week. Knew exactly where trouble would break out. Had himself positioned perfectly to step in if needed. The ranch itself underwent a transformation that seemed to defy the laws of time and physical limitation. Working alone, Reynolds restored the old Henderson place to its former glory and beyond. But mixed with the typical improvements were oddities that caught the attention of more observant visitors. The new fence posts were placed at precise intervals, creating clear firing lanes. The barn doors were reinforced with steel plating, strong enough to stop bullets. Even the well had been repositioned to provide cover from multiple angles. "He's building a fortress," Sheriff Morrison realized one afternoon, studying the ranch through his spyglass. But is he keeping something out? Or keeping something in? Isabella Ramirez, whose store offered the best view of the street, began noting patterns in Reynolds' behavior. He'd arrive precisely on schedule, but his route to the store would vary each time. Sometimes he'd approach from the north, other times from the south. He'd spend exactly 17 minutes inside, buying the same supplies plus one random item that changed weekly. "It's like he's trying to be predictable and unpredictable at the same time," she told Dr. Wright. "Regular enough not to draw attention, but random enough that no one could plan around his movements." One detail that particularly caught Isabella's attention was his treatment of newcomers. Whenever a stranger rode into town, Reynolds would appear within minutes, as if somehow alerted to their presence. He never approached them directly, but would position himself where he could observe their behavior, assess their intentions. More than once, she'd noticed how troublemakers would suddenly decide to move on after catching sight of those silver colts and the quiet man who carried them. The Shadow Riders' scouts watching from the hills reported these patterns to Blackjack Thorne with growing unease. "Man's got the whole town dancing to his rhythm," one scout reported. "But it's not natural-like. Everything's too perfect, too planned. And there's something else, way he moves, way he watches. Reminds me of stories my pa used to tell about ghost shot Reynolds." Thorne dismissed their concerns with his usual arrogance. "You're spooked by shadows. Man's just another has been trying to look important. Week from now he'll be dead or gone and Whisper Creek will be ours." But Ezra Thorne, watching Reynolds through a stolen army telescope, saw something his brother missed. "He's not just watching the town," he muttered. "He's watching us. Every time we move a scout, every time we change position, he knows. Those rides he takes at sunset, he's mapping our movements, learning our patterns while we think we're learning his." The tension built slowly, like storm clouds gathering over distant peaks. Reynolds continued his daily routines, each movement precise, each action calculated. But those who looked closely saw the signs of approaching violence. The way he'd started stockpiling ammunition at the ranch, the extra medical supplies he'd ordered through Dr. Wright, the careful way he'd begun teaching basic shooting skills to some of the townspeople, as if preparing them for something. "War's coming," Nathan Harrison declared one evening at Parker's saloon. "Man like that doesn't prepare so carefully unless he knows something's on the horizon. Question is, what kind of storm are we looking at?" The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would shake Whisper Creek to its very foundations. The legend of Ghost Shot Reynolds was about to be reborn in blood and gunsmoke, and not everyone would survive to tell the tale. The first real test of Reynolds' resolve came not from the Shadow Riders, but from a gang of local rustlers who'd been plaguing the smaller ranches around Whisper Creek. Led by a brutal man known as Scarface Jenkins, they'd grown bold enough to strike in broad daylight, counting on their numbers and reputation to keep potential witnesses quiet. If you're invested in this tale of frontier justice, hit that subscribe button. There's more action coming your way. It was a crisp morning in late April when Jenkins and his crew decided to target Reynolds' small herd of cattle. They'd watched his routine, noted his solitary habits, and decided the quiet rancher would be an easy mark. 6 men, all hardened by years of theft and violence, rode onto his property just after sunrise. What they didn't know was that Reynolds had been aware of their presence since they crossed Thunder Ridge. The wind chimes he'd positioned strategically around his property had sung their warning, and the carefully arranged mirrors had caught their movement long before they reached his fence line. "Remember," Jenkins told his men, "quick and quiet. Old man's probably still sleeping." The rustler's scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. "But if he shows up, well, accidents happen." Reynolds was waiting for them by the corral, that worn cavalry coat hanging loose around his shoulders. He stood with the same deadly stillness that had unnerved Rattler Ross, those silver colts catching the morning light. "Morning, gentlemen," he said softly, his voice carrying across the yard like distant thunder. "Seems you've lost your way." Jenkins, not used to being confronted so directly, felt the first stirrings of unease. Something about Reynolds's stance, the way he held himself, sent warning signals through the Rustlers' battle-hardened instincts. "Just passing through," Jenkins managed, his hand inching toward his gun. "No need for trouble." "There's always a choice," Reynolds replied, those storm-gray eyes studying each man in turn. "You can ride out now, leave this valley, find honest work, or you can try your luck." His right hand hadn't moved toward his guns, but somehow that made him seem more dangerous, not less. One of Jenkins' men, a hot-headed youth named Billy, decided to force the issue. His gun had barely cleared leather when Reynolds moved. The speed was otherworldly. No dramatic draw, no flourish, just the sharp crack of a silver Colt appearing in his hand as if by magic. Billy's gun went spinning away, a neat hole drilled through its cylinder. The young rustler stood frozen, staring at his empty hand in disbelief. "That's one," Reynolds said quietly. "Anyone else want to test their luck?" Two more rustlers drew, their movements quick and coordinated. Reynolds's left Colt materialized to join his right, and in the space of a heartbeat, both men found themselves disarmed, their weapons disabled with surgical precision. "3," Reynolds counted, his voice never rising above that quiet tone. "Starting to see a pattern here?" Dr. Wright, who witnessed the confrontation from the road where she'd been making her morning rounds, would later describe it as a dance where only one partner knew the steps. Reynolds moved like flowing water, each motion precise and economical, never wasting a single movement. Jenkins, watching his men's guns fall useless into the dust, felt cold sweat trickle down his spine. He'd faced lawmen before, crossed guns with some of the territory's fastest draws, but this was different. This wasn't just speed or skill. This was something else entirely. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Nobody's that fast." Reynolds's response was characteristically measured. "Just a rancher trying to live quiet. But you should ask around about ghost-shot Reynolds before you try something like this again. Might save you some trouble." The name hit Jenkins like a physical blow. He'd heard the stories everyone had. Tales of a lawman who could disarm 6 men in the time it took to blink, who never killed unless he had to but never missed when he did. "Ghost shot's dead," Jenkins whispered. But there was no conviction in his voice. "Rumors of my death," Reynolds replied softly, "have been greatly exaggerated. Now ride out and spread the word. Whisper Creek is off limits." The rustlers didn't need to be told twice. They fled, leaving their ruined guns behind, their reputation in tatters. As they vanished over Thunder Ridge, Dr. Wright approached Reynolds, her medical bag in hand. "Could have killed them all," she observed, studying his calm demeanor. "Death's easy," Reynolds replied, holstering his Colts with fluid grace. "Living with it's the hard part. Sometimes mercy leaves a stronger message than violence." Word of the confrontation spread through Whisper Creek like wildfire. 6 men, all known gun hands, all disarmed without a single death. It seemed impossible, yet Dr. Wright's testimony, along with the collection of ruined guns Reynolds had turned over to Sheriff Morrison, provided irrefutable proof. The incident changed something in the town's perception of their quiet neighbor. This wasn't just a skilled gunman trying to live peacefully. This was a legend come to life. A ghost story made flesh and blood. But in the Shadow Riders camp, the news brought different reactions. Blackjack Thorne saw it as confirmation that Reynolds needed to be dealt with quickly. Caleb viewed it as a challenge to overcome. But Ezra, the youngest and wisest of the brothers, recognized it for what it was. A warning. He didn't just beat them, Ezra told his brothers. He taught them a lesson. Man like that, choosing not to kill when he could. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that makes legends. The storm clouds were gathering over Whisper Creek, and the legend of Ghost Shot Reynolds was about to be tested, like never before. The Shadow Riders announced their presence in Whisper Creek with characteristic brutality. They didn't ride straight into town. Men like the Thorns preferred to let fear do their work first. 2 outlying farms were hit in the dead of night, their barns burned, their livestock scattered. No one was killed, but the message was clear. Protection would come at a price. Before we continue with this tale of impending confrontation, make sure you're subscribed to catch every moment of this epic story. The first riders from the gang appeared on a Thursday morning, deliberately choosing the day after Reynolds' usual supply run. 3 men, led by Caleb Viper Thorne, walked into town like they owned it, their silver spurs singing a song of menace with each step. Their reputation preceded them. The Shadow Riders had already claimed 3 towns along the Colorado-Kansas border, each conquest bloodier than the last. Caleb was everything Samuel Reynolds wasn't: loud, flashy, and eager to demonstrate his power. Where Reynolds moved like flowing water, Caleb strutted like a predator, his elaborate silver-mounted pistols displayed prominently on his hips. His face bore a network of thin scars, souvenirs from countless knife fights, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who enjoyed causing pain. He and his companions made a show of inspecting each business along Main Street, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. Noah Parker watched them dump a full bottle of his best whiskey on the saloon floor, just to prove they could. Catherine Morgan's telegraph office received similar treatment, with Caleb making a point of reading through private messages while his men laughed. When they reached Isabella's store, Caleb made his move. The shop was her life's work, built from savings earned through years of careful management and hard work. Every item on its shelves represented a small piece of her dream of independence. "Nice place you got here, señorita," he drawled, deliberately knocking goods off her shelves. "Shame if anything were to happen to it. My brothers and I offer reasonable rates for protection. Way we see it, that's just good business." Isabella stood her ground, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "I already have all the protection I need." Caleb's hand dropped to his gun. "That's so. Would this protection be that quiet rancher everyone's been whispering about? The one they say might be Ghost Shot Reynolds?" He spat on the floor. "Way I heard it, Ghost Shot's been dead for years. Whoever your friend is, he's just borrowing a dead man's reputation." The store's bell chimed softly. Samuel Reynolds stood in the doorway, his black coat dusted from the trail. He hadn't drawn his silver Colts, hadn't made any aggressive moves. He just stood there, those storm-gray eyes taking in the scene with the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty in one's abilities. "Mr. Reynolds," Caleb's smile turned predatory. "Heard you were particular about your schedule, but here you are, a day early. Come to protect the lady's honor." "The lady doesn't need protection," Reynolds replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you might—" Something in his tone made Caleb's smile falter. Even the most hardened killers develop instincts for danger, and everything about Reynolds' stillness set those instincts screaming. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle creak of the ceiling fan turning lazy circles overhead. Caleb's hand twitched toward his gun. Before his fingers could even brush leather, Reynolds's coat rippled. One silver Colt materialized in his hand as if conjured from thin air. No one saw him draw, just the result. "That's the thing about ghosts," Reynolds said quietly, his gun unwavering. "By the time you see them, it's already too late." Dr. Wright, who had been watching from her office across the street, later described what she saw. "It wasn't just the speed, though Lord knows that was something supernatural. It was the absolute certainty in his movements. No hesitation, no doubt, just pure, focused intention." Caleb Thorne, for all his bravado, was no fool. He'd heard stories of men who tried to outdraw Ghost Shot Reynolds. None of those stories had happy endings. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. "Just having a friendly business discussion," Caleb managed, backing toward the door. "No harm done." "Then ride out," Reynolds suggested. "Tell your brothers that Whisper Creek isn't interested in their kind of business." They left, trying to maintain their dignity, while their instincts screamed at them to run. As soon as they were gone, Isabella turned to thank Reynolds, but he was already moving toward the door. "Bar your windows tonight," he said softly. "Keep your shotgun close." Word of the confrontation spread quickly. Sheriff Morrison, watching from his office with Dr. Wright, knew this was only the beginning. Blackjack won't take this lying down, the doctor observed grimly. His whole reputation is built on fear. If one man stands up to them, then others might follow, Morrison finished. Question is, what's their next move? They didn't have to wait long for an answer. That night, a rider arrived from the south, his horse lathered and breathing hard. The Shadow Riders' main force had been spotted, 30 men strong, with all 3 Thorne brothers leading them. They were riding hard for Whisper Creek, and their reputation for violence suggested that this time there would be no warning shots. At his ranch, Reynolds made his preparations with methodical precision. Those who rode past reported seeing him working on his property, setting up defenses that seemed excessive for simple cattle ranching. Dr. Wright, bringing news from town, recognized the preparations for what they were. He's setting up a killing ground, she told Morrison. Same way Ghost Shot did during the Carson County War. The Thorns think they're riding in to break a legend. Instead, they're walking into a trap. The stage was set. Whisper Creek held its breath, caught between Reynolds' deadly calm and the approaching storm of the Shadow Riders. The legend of Ghost Shot was about to be tested once again, and this time an entire town would bear witness to the truth behind the whispered tales. The truth about Samuel Reynolds' identity came not with gunfire, but with the arrival of an old friend. Marcus Iron Hand Hawthorne, U.S. Marshal for the Kansas Territory, rode into Whisper Creek on a storm-gray morning, his badge catching the weak sunlight. His reaction upon seeing Reynolds in the street was immediate and visceral. If you're following this tale of legends and justice, don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the American frontier. Sweet Jesus, Hawthorne breathed, his weathered hand instinctively moving toward his gun before freezing halfway. The ghost still walks. Sheriff Morrison, sharing his morning coffee with the marshal on the jail's porch, nearly choked. The ghost? You don't mean... Ghost Shot Reynolds, Hawthorne confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. Fastest gun in 3 territories, before the Carson County War. They said he could shoot a playing card in half lengthwise at 30 paces. Some claimed he could draw and fire 6 shots before a dropped coin hit the ground. Inside Morrison's office, Hawthorne shared what he knew. 10 years ago, Reynolds had been a legend in the making, a lawman whose speed with a gun was matched only by his dedication to justice. His reputation grew with each outlaw he brought to justice, earning him the nickname Ghost Shot for his supernatural speed and accuracy. But it wasn't just that he was fast, Hawthorne explained, pacing the small office. He was precise, surgical, could shoot a gun out of a man's hand at 20 paces or put a bullet through his heart, whichever the situation called for. Never saw anyone who could match him. I remember a time in Dodge City. 7 men had taken over the bank, all experienced gun hands. Reynolds walked in through the front door bold as brass. Nobody saw him draw, but when the smoke cleared, all 7 were disarmed, not a single one dead. Dr. Wright, who had joined them out of professional curiosity, leaned forward. What changed? Hawthorne's face darkened. The Carson County War. Not a war in the traditional sense, but a bloody feud between cattle barons that spiraled into open warfare. Reynolds and his younger brother Thomas, also a lawman, tried to keep the peace, but one side, the notorious Warner clan, decided to send a message. He paused, pouring himself a shot of whiskey with a trembling hand. They caught Thomas alone at his ranch, tortured him for hours before killing him. Some say they wanted information about cattle movements, others say they just wanted to draw his brother out. Thomas was the gentle one, you see. Always trying to solve things peacefully, always giving men a chance to reform. They killed him slowly, making sure word would get back to his brother. The office fell silent as Hawthorne continued, his voice heavy with memory. I was there when Reynolds found the body. Never seen a man change so completely in a single moment. The lawman who believed in justice, in giving men a chance to surrender. He died that day alongside his brother. What emerged was something else entirely. The man who emerged after that wasn't the same Ghost Shot Reynolds who'd always given men a chance to surrender. He became something else, a force of nature that tore through the Warner clan like a prairie fire. 23 men, Hawthorne said, shaking his head. That's how many he killed in 2 months. Every single person involved in his brother's death, from the triggermen to those who just stood watch. He found them all no matter where they ran. Catherine Morgan, listening from her usual corner, added her own piece to the puzzle. I was working the wire in Dodge City back then. The reports that came in, they said he moved like a ghost, appearing and disappearing like smoke. The Warner boys tried hiding in a saloon in Abilene. Witnesses said he walked in, didn't say a word. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead, and Reynolds hadn't even gotten his duster dirty. Each kill was different, Hawthorne continued, lost in the memories. Some were quick, clean. Others, well, he made sure the ones who'd hurt Thomas worst suffered most. The Warner clan tried everything, hired guns, ambushes, even tried burning him out. Nothing worked. He was like a ghost, untouchable. Then he just vanished, Hawthorne continued. Some said he died in a shootout in Mexico. Others claimed he'd hung up his guns and disappeared into the wilderness. Nobody really knew. Until now. Isabella Ramirez, who had been quietly restocking her shelves, paused in her work. He's different here, she observed. Gentle with the children, always ready with a kind word or helping hand. But there's something in his eyes sometimes when he thinks no one's watching. Pain, Dr. Wright finished. The kind that doesn't heal clean. I've seen it in soldiers after the war. The kind that changes a man forever. Nathan Harrison, who'd entered during the conversation, nodded thoughtfully. Explains his setup at the ranch, too. The mirrors, the wind chimes, the careful positioning of everything. Man's not just protecting himself. He's preparing for something specific. Been watching him practice every morning. Way he shoots, it's not just about hitting targets. He's fighting ghosts, preparing for a very specific kind of battle. The Shadow Riders, Morrison realized. He knew they'd come eventually. Men like the Thorns can't resist trying to break a legend. Hawthorne's expression grew grim. Blackjack Thorns made his reputation breaking men like Reynolds. Takes over peaceful towns by destroying anyone strong enough to rally resistance. But he's never faced anything like Ghost Shot. The stories about Reynolds, they don't do him justice. I've seen him in action. It's not just speed or accuracy. It's like he can see things before they happen, like he knows where every bullet's going to go before it's fired. Is that why you're really here, Marshal? Dr. Wright asked shrewdly. To warn Reynolds about the Thorns? Hawthorne shook his head. To warn the Thorns about Reynolds, but I'm too late. When I heard they were heading this way, I rode hard hoping to prevent what's coming. Ghost Shot Reynolds isn't just another gunslinger they can intimidate or overwhelm with numbers. He's a legend for a reason, and some legends are better left undisturbed. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of gunfire from Reynolds's ranch. 6 shots, precise and measured, each finding its mark with supernatural accuracy. The sound seemed to underscore Hawthorne's words, a reminder that some legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world why they became legends in the first place. There's something else, Hawthorne added quietly. Something that even the stories don't mention. Every man Reynolds killed during the Carson County War, he gave them a chance first. Even after what they did to Thomas, even consumed by vengeance as he was, he always offered them a choice. The ones who died because they chose to fight. That's what makes him truly dangerous. It's not just his speed or his accuracy, it's his absolute certainty in what he's doing. The truth about Reynolds' identity spread through Whisper Creek like wildfire, though few dared speak of it above a whisper. The quiet rancher who'd settled among them wasn't just any gunslinger. He was Ghost Shot Reynolds, the man who'd become a legend and then a ghost, now risen from the grave to face one final storm. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Whisper Creek, and as thunder rolled over distant mountains, Samuel Reynolds cleaned his silver Colts with the same methodical precision that had made him a legend, preparing for a reckoning that had been years in the making. With the Shadow Riders approaching and Reynolds' true identity revealed, Whisper Creek transformed from a peaceful frontier town into a fortress. Reynolds moved with calculated precision, turning the entire valley into an elaborate defensive position that would have made his old cavalry commanders proud. If you're invested in this tale of frontier justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button. He's not just defending the town, Marshal Hawthorne explained to Sheriff Morrison as they watched Reynolds work. He's creating a funnel. Every fence, every building, every line of sight. It's all positioned to force the thorns exactly where he wants them. Seen him do this before, during the Carson County War. Turned an entire valley into a trap. Reynolds began by teaching basic shooting skills to any townsperson willing to learn. His methods were unconventional, but effective. Speed doesn't matter, he told them in that quiet voice. Accuracy does. A slow shot that hits is better than 6 fast ones that miss. He worked with each volunteer personally, correcting stances, adjusting grips, teaching them to think of their guns as tools rather than weapons. Dr. Wright converted her clinic into a makeshift field hospital, stockpiling bandages and medicines. Reynolds helped me plan it, she told Isabella. Knew exactly what we'd need, down to the last bandage. Man's seen his share of gunfights. The way he described potential wounds, likely injury patterns. It was like listening to a surgeon discuss his craft. The town's layout itself became part of Reynolds' strategy. Every alley was blocked or cleared according to his precise instructions. Mirrors were positioned on key buildings, allowing defenders to see around corners without exposing themselves. Wind chimes were hung at strategic points, their gentle music serving as an early warning system. Each position was carefully chosen to support at least 2 others, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn any direct assault into a costly mistake. It's like watching a chess master, Catherine Morgan observed. Every piece placed just so, every move planned 10 steps ahead. He's not just thinking about where the thorns will be. He's thinking about where they'll have to go when their first plans fail. Noah Parker's saloon was transformed into a central strongpoint. The windows were reinforced with steel plates salvaged from abandoned mining equipment. Firing positions were established behind the bar and on the upper floor, each offering clear shots at predetermined kill zones while providing maximum cover for defenders. Man knows what he's doing, Parker admitted, watching Reynolds test sightlines. Showed me how to set up crossfire zones I didn't even know existed. Way he explains it makes you wonder how many times he's done this before. But it was at his ranch that Reynolds' true tactical genius showed. The property became a masterpiece of defensive preparation. Each fence post doubled as cover, with precise measurements between them to allow accurate distance estimation. Gates were rigged with hidden mechanisms that could turn them into instant barriers. The barn, reinforced with steel plating, was transformed into a hardened strongpoint that could serve as either a fallback position or a deadly trap for unwary attackers. Seen my share of military fortifications, Marshal Hawthorne told Morrison, but this is something else. He's not just preparing for a fight. He's orchestrating a performance, and the Shadow Riders are about to become unwilling players in his show. Every angle, every approach, it's all been calculated to channel them exactly where he wants them. The preparations didn't go unnoticed by the Thorns' scouts. Reports filtered back to their camp, causing growing concern among the gang's more experienced members. Man's turning the whole valley into a killing ground, one scout warned. Every approach covered, every escape route compromised. It's like he's building a maze where all paths lead to the same deadly end. Blackjack Thorne dismissed these concerns with his usual arrogance. Doesn't matter how fancy his setup is, 30 guns against 1 will always win. Man's just showing his fear, trying to hide behind walls and tricks. But Ezra Thorne, watching through his telescope, saw what his brother missed. He's not preparing to fight 30 men at once, he realized. He's preparing to fight us one at a time, using our own numbers against us. Every position he's setting up, it's designed to separate us, to turn our strength into a weakness. Reynolds worked tirelessly, each action precise and purposeful. The townspeople noticed how he would spend hours studying the terrain, memorizing every shadow, every angle, every possible position where a man might try to hide. His silver Colts were never far from reach, but it was his mind, not his guns, that proved most impressive during these preparations. It's not just about the shooting. he explained to young Tommy Chen, who had become his unofficial assistant. It's about knowing where everyone will be before they get there. In a gunfight, the man who controls the battlefield controls the outcome. Every piece of cover, every line of sight, it's all part of a larger plan. As the week progressed, more subtle preparations came into play. Reynolds established a system of signals using mirrors and lanterns, allowing defenders to communicate silently across the town. He taught the basics of reading tracks and wind direction to key townspeople, ensuring they could spot approaching riders before they were seen. The tension built with each passing day. Reynolds's quiet confidence seemed to infect the town, turning fear into determination. Even those who had initially thought of fleeing now stood their ground, inspired by the methodical way their quiet defender prepared for the coming storm. "Man's not just teaching us to fight," Isabella observed, watching him drill another group of volunteers. "He's teaching us to believe we can win. Every preparation, every lesson, it's all building toward something bigger than just survival." The stage was set, the players positioned, and as thunder rolled over distant mountains, Samuel "Ghost Shot" Reynolds made his final preparations for a confrontation that would become the stuff of legend. The quiet rancher who had sought peace would soon remind the world why his name had once been whispered in fear across 3 territories. The Shadow Riders announced their arrival with fire. 3 outlying farms went up in flames just before dawn, their owners barely escaping with their lives. Blackjack Thorne was sending a message: surrender or burn. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe. Reynolds watched the flames from his porch, those storm-gray eyes reflecting the distant infernos. He'd been expecting this, the first move in a deadly game of chess where the pieces were men and the stakes were measured in blood. "Classic Thorne strategy," Marshal Hawthorne explained to the town council gathered in Morrison's office. "Start with outlying targets, create panic, make folks feel isolated. Man's done this before in Kansas and Wyoming." Blackjack Thorne himself rode into Whisper Creek the next morning, leading a dozen of his best men. He cut an imposing figure on his black stallion, his signature silver-mounted Winchester gleaming in the morning sun. Unlike his brother Caleb's flashy entrance days before, this was a deliberate show of force. The town fell silent as the riders passed down Main Street. Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, but everyone felt his presence. The mirrors he'd positioned caught the sunlight. The wind chimes sang their quiet warning, and every defender waited in their assigned positions. Thorne dismounted outside Parker's saloon, his spurs ringing against the wooden boardwalk. "Ghost Shot Reynolds," he called out, his voice carrying down the empty street. "Time we had a talk about the future of Whisper Creek." The silence stretched like pulled leather. Then, from nowhere and everywhere, Reynolds' voice replied, soft as distant thunder. "Nothing to talk about, Thorne. Ride out while you can." Blackjack's face darkened. 30 guns against 1, Ghost Shot. Even legends can't beat those odds. "Numbers didn't help the Warner clan," Reynolds replied, still unseen. "Didn't help Rattler Ross, won't help you." The mention of the Warner clan sparked whispers among Thorne's men. They'd all heard the stories. 23 men hunted down one by one, each death a testament to Ghost Shot's legendary skill. "That was 10 years ago," Thorne sneered. "You're older now, slower, and I ain't some cattle baron's hired gun." Reynolds finally appeared, stepping out of the shadows between buildings. His black duster moved like smoke in the morning breeze, those silver colts riding low on his hips. "Last chance, Thorne. Take your men and go." Instead, Blackjack gave a subtle signal. 2 of his men, positioned on nearby rooftops, drew their rifles. Before they could aim, Reynolds' silver colt seemed to materialize in his hands. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like one. Both rifles went spinning away, their barrels split by precisely placed bullets. "That's 2, Reynolds said quietly. "Want to try for 30? The speed was otherworldly. No one had seen him draw. No one had seen him aim. Just the result. 2 expert marksmen disarmed before they could pull their triggers. Dr. Wright, watching from her clinic window, saw something in Reynolds' stance that others missed. "He's not just fast," she whispered to Isabella. "He's efficient. No wasted motion, no dramatic flourish, like a surgeon making precise cuts." Thorne's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. They'd heard stories about ghost-shot Reynolds, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. This wasn't just speed or accuracy. This was something beyond normal human capability. "Impressive trick," Thorne managed, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "But tricks won't save this town. You've got 1 hour to clear out, Reynolds. After that, we burn Whisper Creek to the ground." Reynolds' response was typical in its simplicity. "You won't live long enough to give that order." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the quiet deadliness, made several of Thorne's men instinctively back their horses away. They'd faced down posses and armies, but this was different. This was death itself, wearing a black duster. As Thorne and his men rode out, Marshal Hawthorne emerged from the sheriff's office. "You could have ended it right there," he observed. "Had clean shots on most of them." "Not yet," Reynolds replied softly. "Man like Thorne, he needs to learn fear before he learns wisdom. Sometimes the hardest lesson is watching everything you believe in fall apart piece by piece." The marshal nodded thoughtfully. "Like you did with the Warner clan. Break them down one by one until there's nothing left but fear." Reynolds checked his silver Colts with practiced precision. "Got something special planned for the Thorns. They learned why they call me Ghost Shot." The hour passed like a held breath. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. The first moves in a deadly game where the stakes were an entire town's future. Blackjack Thorne had built his reputation on breaking men like Reynolds, but he'd never faced anything like Ghost Shot. The Shadow Riders' first real attack came at midnight, a probing assault designed to test Whisper Creek's defenses. A dozen riders approached from the north, torches in hand, expecting to find a sleeping town. Instead, they rode straight into Reynolds' carefully prepared kill zone. If you're following this tale of justice, hit that subscribe button. The wind chimes sang their warning as the riders crossed the valley's entrance. Reynolds, positioned on his ranch house roof, waited until they passed the first marker, a broken fence post exactly 40 yards from his position. His silver Colts spoke 6 times in rapid succession, the shots so close together they sounded like a single rolling thunderclap. 6 torches went dark, shot from their bearers' hands with surgical precision. Before the riders could react, 6 more shots followed, disarming half the group in less time than it takes to draw a breath. "Jesus Christ," one rider gasped, staring at his shattered gun. "He's not human." The remaining armed men tried to return fire, but Reynolds had vanished, melting into the darkness like his namesake. Shots rang out from a new position, precise and deadly. More weapons went spinning into the dirt, their owners cursing in pain and fear. "He's everywhere," someone shouted. The panic in his voice sparked a general retreat, the riders fleeing back into the night, leaving their wounded weapons and shattered confidence behind. Blackjack Thorne, watching from a distant ridge through his spyglass, felt the first real stirring of doubt. 12 men, he muttered. "Didn't kill a single one but disabled them all. Who fights like that?" "A man making a point," Ezra answered softly. "He's showing us he could have killed them all, proving death isn't his only option." The failed raid changed something in the valley's atmosphere. The Shadow Riders' aura of invincibility had cracked, showing the fear beneath their bravado. Reynolds had demonstrated not just his legendary speed and accuracy, but a level of tactical thinking that turned simple defense into psychological warfare. Marshal Hawthorne, examining the dropped weapons the next morning, shook his head in amazement. "Every shot was placed perfectly," he told Morrison. "Didn't just disable the guns. He made sure each bullet caused enough pain to make them remember, but not enough to cripple." Dr. Wright, treating the wounded raiders who couldn't make it back to their camp, made her own observations. "The precision is incredible," she explained to Isabella. "Each wound is calculated to hurt, to teach a lesson, but designed to heal cleanly. This isn't just skill. It's art." Reynolds spent the morning teaching the town's defenders what he'd learned from the night's engagement. "They'll come in force next time," he warned. "But now they're scared. Fear makes men predictable, makes them bunch up, and seek safety in numbers. That's when they're most vulnerable." The Shadow Riders' camp was in chaos. The failed raid had shaken their confidence, sparked arguments among the leadership. Some wanted to leave. Others demanded an all-out assault. Blackjack Thorne watched his authority eroding with each passing hour. "We hit them with everything," he finally decided. "Full force, all directions. No one man can watch everywhere at once." But Caleb, nursing his wounded pride from his earlier encounter with Reynolds, saw the flaw in this plan. "That's what he wants," he argued. "To split us up, deal with us in smaller groups. Man's turned the whole valley into a shooting gallery." Even as they argued, Reynolds was preparing the next phase of his strategy. The town's defenders watched in amazement as he positioned mirrors and wind chimes in new configurations, creating what he called ghost zones, areas where reflected movement and sound would make attackers think he was everywhere at once. "Mind games," Nathan Harrison observed, helping to set up the defenses, breaking them down piece by piece before the real fight even starts. Isabella noticed other changes too. Reynolds had begun positioning supplies and ammunition at specific points throughout the town, preparing for what he called the long game. Each cache was hidden but accessible, part of a larger strategy that only he fully understood. "He's not just defending anymore," Catherine Morgan realized, watching him work. "He's getting ready to take the fight to them." The turning point came when 3 more Shadow Riders deserted during the night, leaving their share of the promised loot behind. They'd seen enough of Ghost Shot Reynolds to know that no amount of money was worth facing those silver colts. Blackjack Thorne, his authority crumbling, knew he had to act soon or lose control entirely. "Tomorrow," he told his remaining men, "we hit them at dawn, full force. No more games, no more testing. We burn everything." But as he looked out over the valley that night, watching the distant lights of Whisper Creek, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing right into Reynolds' hands. The legend of Ghost Shot was growing stronger with each passing hour, while his own fearsome reputation was beginning to fade like morning mist. The stage was set for the final confrontation, but as Marshal Hawthorne observed to Dr. Wright, "The real fight's already half won. Ghost Shot's doing what he does best, breaking them down from the inside out, turning their own fears against them." Thunder rolled over distant mountains, promising a storm that would change Whisper Creek forever. The Shadow Riders attacked at dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountain peaks gold. Blackjack Thorne led the charge himself. 30 riders spread out in a wide arc as they thundered into the valley. They came in force, weapons ready, expecting to overwhelm Whisper Creek's defenses through sheer numbers. If you've been following this tale of justice in the Old West, make sure you're subscribed for what comes next. The valley welcomed them with silence. No shots fired, no defenders visible, just the gentle music of wind chimes dancing in the morning breeze. The riders slowed, uncertainty replacing their initial bravado. They'd expected resistance, not this eerie calm that seemed to watch their every move. "He's playing with us," Caleb warned, his voice carrying an edge of fear. "This is what he did in Carson County, making us jump at shadows before he strikes." But Blackjack was past listening. He'd committed everything to this assault, and retreat was no longer an option. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere, its echo bouncing off the valley walls. One of Thorne's men found his gun spinning away, its barrel split clean through. Before anyone could react, 2 more shots followed, each finding its mark with supernatural precision. The wounded men clutched their hands, their weapons ruined, their confidence shattered. "Spread out," Blackjack ordered, but he was playing into Reynolds' hands. As the riders separated, they rode into carefully prepared kill zones, each movement predicted and countered before it began. The mirrors Reynolds had positioned caught the morning sun, creating ghostly reflections that made it impossible to tell where the next shot would come from. Reynolds seemed to materialize from the shadows, those silver Colts gleaming in the early light. 6 shots rang out, so fast they blended together, and 6 more riders found themselves disarmed. He vanished again before anyone could return fire, only to appear at another position, his black duster moving like smoke in the mountain air. "It's like fighting a ghost," one rider screamed, clutching his wounded hand. The panic began to spread as more guns went flying, each shot placed with surgical precision. Reynolds moved through the chaos like a spirit of vengeance, appearing and disappearing at will, each appearance marked by the distinctive report of those silver Colts. Dr. Wright, watching from her clinic, saw the strategy unfold. "He's not just shooting," she told Marshal Hawthorne. "He's hurting them, using their fear to drive them exactly where he wants them. Look how each group he disarms ends up blocking the escape route for the others." The town's defenders, positioned according to Reynolds's careful instructions, added their own fire to the chaos, not aiming to kill but to contain and control, just as he'd taught them. Every shot drove the Shadow Riders deeper into Reynolds's trap, transforming their numerical advantage into a disadvantage as they got in each other's way. Nathan Harrison, watching from his position near the livery stable, understood the genius of it. "He's using their own numbers against them," he explained to Sheriff Morrison. "More men just means more confusion, more chaos. Man's turned the whole valley into a chessboard, and the Thorns never stood a chance." Blackjack Thorne, watching his carefully planned assault dissolve into confusion, finally understood. He's been 10 steps ahead since the beginning, he realized. Everything, the mirrors, the wind chimes, the defensive positions. It was all to prepare for this moment. We thought we were hunting him, but he's been hunting us all along. Reynolds appeared on the main street, that black duster moving like smoke in the morning light. "Last chance, Thorne," his quiet voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Surrender or learn why they really called me Ghost Shot." In response, Blackjack raised his Winchester, but Reynolds's draw was like lightning. The rifle went spinning away, its action shattered by a perfectly placed shot. 2 more shots followed, disarming Caleb and Ezra before they could clear leather. The speed was otherworldly, and the accuracy impossible. "That's 3, Reynolds counted softly. "Want to try for the rest?" The remaining Shadow Riders, watching their leaders disarmed with such casual ease, began throwing down their weapons. The legend of Ghost Shot Reynolds had come to life before their eyes, and no amount of money was worth facing those silver Colts. But Blackjack Thorne, his reputation in tatters, made one last desperate move. He pulled a hidden derringer, aiming not at Reynolds but at Isabella, who stood in her store doorway. "Let's see how fast you really are, Ghost Shot." What happened next would be talked about in whispers for decades. Reynolds moved like his namesake, faster than the eye could follow. 3 shots rang out simultaneously. One knocked the derringer from Thorne's hand, another disabled Caleb's backup gun before he could draw it, and the third split Ezra's knife in half as he reached for it. Each shot was perfect, each one calculated to disarm without killing. "Impossible," Blackjack whispered, staring at his empty hand. "No one's that fast." "Speed's not what makes me dangerous," Reynolds replied quietly. "It's knowing what you'll do before you do it. Same mistake the Warner clan made, thinking quantity beats quality. Thinking that enough guns can overcome skill and planning. You could have killed us all." Ezra realized, looking at his ruined knife. "Every shot, every move, you were holding back." Reynolds holstered his silver Colts with fluid grace. "Death's final," he said softly. "But memory lasts. The Warner clan taught me that killing isn't always the best revenge. Sometimes living with defeat with the knowledge that everything you believed about yourself was wrong, that's the harder punishment." The Shadow Riders' reign of terror ended not with a grand shootout, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Sheriff Morrison and Marshal Hawthorne took the Thorne brothers into custody, while the remaining gang members surrendered without a fight. The legend of Ghost Shot Reynolds grew that day, but it changed too. No longer was he just the deadly specter who'd hunted down 23 men. Now he was something else, a protector who could end a fight without taking a life, a legend who chose mercy over vengeance. The storm had passed, but Whisper Creek would never be the same. The quiet rancher with the silver Colts had shown them all that true strength lies not in how many men you can kill, but in knowing when not to. The days following the Shadow Riders' defeat brought changes to Whisper Creek that few could have predicted. The town that had lived in fear of 30 riders found itself housing them instead, in the newly expanded jail that Sheriff Morrison had built in preparation for the confrontation. If this tale of frontier justice has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe for more legendary stories. Marshal Hawthorne supervised the prisoners' transfer personally, watching as the once fearsome Shadow Riders were led away in chains. The Thorne brothers traveled separately, too dangerous to keep together, even in defeat. Blackjack was bound for the territorial prison in Denver, while his brothers faced justice in Kansas and Wyoming for their earlier crimes. "Never seen anything like it," Hawthorne told Morrison as they watched the prison wagons depart. 30 men, all expert gun hands, and not a single death. Ghost Shot didn't just beat them. He broke them without killing them. That's the kind of victory that becomes legend. The captured Shadow Riders themselves became a source of stories that spread across the territories. Men who had once boasted of their fearlessness now spoke in whispers about the ghost-like figure who had appeared and disappeared at will, disarming them with supernatural precision. Some claimed he had moved faster than humanly possible, others swore he had been in multiple places at once. It wasn't just the speed, one rider told Dr. Wright as she treated his wounded hand. It was knowing, like he could read our minds, knew what we were going to do before we did it. Never seen anything like it, never want to again. Reynolds himself seemed unchanged by his triumph, going about his daily routine with the same quiet precision that had marked his arrival. But those who looked closely saw subtle differences. The silver Colts rode a little looser on his hips as if their burden had lightened. His eyes, though still watchful, had lost some of their haunted quality. Dr. Wright, tending to the wounded Shadow Riders before their transfer, made an interesting observation. Every injury was exactly the same, she explained to Isabella. Clean, precise, designed to disable without crippling. The kind of shooting that takes more control than killing. It's like he was performing surgery with those silver Colts. The town itself underwent a transformation. Reynolds' reputation, now fully revealed and enhanced by his victory, drew a different kind of attention. Law-abiding settlers began arriving, drawn by stories of a place where justice prevailed over violence. The railroad, which had long bypassed Whisper Creek, suddenly showed renewed interest in running a spur line through. Noah Parker's saloon, once a place of wary tension, became a gathering spot for townsfolk eager to recount their own perspectives on the battle. Each telling added new details, new observations about how Reynolds had turned the entire valley into a masterpiece of tactical precision. "Man's changed more than just the town," Nathan Harrison observed, watching new buildings rise along Main Street. "He's changed how people think about solving problems. After seeing him take down 30 men without killing a single one, folks are starting to realize there's always another way." Catherine Morgan's telegraph office became busier than ever, sending news of Ghost Shot's victory across the territories. But the stories that spread weren't just about his speed or accuracy. They told of a man who could have killed 30 outlaws but chose a harder path, a legend who proved that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. Even the children of Whisper Creek felt the change. Young Tommy Chen, who had watched the battle from his father's laundry window, began organizing games where the heroes captured the outlaws without hurting them, mimicking Reynolds' precision with wooden guns. "The thing about legends," Marshal Hawthorne explained to Tommy, "is that they grow beyond the man. Ghost Shot Reynolds didn't just save our town, he showed everyone a different kind of strength. That's the kind of story that changes how people think." One evening, about a week after the battle, Isabella found Reynolds on his porch cleaning those silver Colts with his usual methodical care. "The Warner clan," she said softly. "You killed them all, didn't you? Why show mercy to the Thorns?" Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, his hands never pausing in their work. "Killing the Warners taught me something," he finally replied. "Revenge fills the emptiness for a while, but it leaves its own kind of hollow. Thomas wouldn't have wanted that. He always believed in giving men a chance to change." The silver colts gleamed in the setting sun as he reassembled them. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't pulling the trigger, it's choosing not to. The Thorns will spend years in prison remembering how one man broke their legend without taking a single life. That's a lesson that'll last longer than any bullet." Sheriff Morrison, watching Reynolds return to his quiet ranching life, understood something that many missed. "Man didn't come here looking for a fight," he told Dr. Wright. "Came here looking for peace. Just turned out that sometimes you have to show men why peace is the better choice." The legend of Ghost Shot Reynolds evolved in the telling. No longer was he just the deadly specter who'd hunted down 23 men in vengeance. Now he was the guardian who'd faced down 30 killers and chosen mercy over murder. The man who proved that the deadliest gun could also be the most precise instrument of justice. Whisper Creek flourished under its quiet guardian's watch. The story of Ghost Shot Reynolds became something parents told their children, not to frighten them, but to teach them that true strength lies not in how many men you can kill, but in knowing when not to pull the trigger at all. The town grew and prospered, attracting merchants, craftsmen, and families seeking a place where justice meant more than just force. The mirrors Reynolds had positioned for defense now caught the sunlight of a growing community, and the wind chimes that had once warned of danger now sang songs of peace. Reynolds himself continued his simple life, mending fences and tending cattle. The silver colts remained at his side, but they were different now. No longer just weapons, but symbols of a choice between vengeance and justice, between the easy path of violence and the harder road of mercy. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel Ghost Shot Reynolds could often be found on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. The legend lived on, but the man had finally found his peace, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from what you destroy, but from what you choose to preserve. Years after the Shadow Riders' defeat, Whisper Creek had become almost unrecognizable from the quiet frontier town Samuel Reynolds had first ridden into. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing with it new opportunities and faces. But some things remained constant. The wind chimes still sang their gentle songs, the mirror still caught the sunlight, and Ghost Shot Reynolds still watched over it all from his ranch near Thunder Ridge. If this story has touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption in the Old West. The legend of Ghost Shot grew and changed with the telling. Each new arrival to town would hear different versions of the story. How one man had faced down 30 killers without taking a single life. How he'd turned an entire valley into a masterpiece of tactical precision. How he'd proven that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. It wasn't just about the guns, Sheriff Morrison would tell newcomers who asked about that fateful day. Any man can learn to shoot fast, learn to be accurate. What made Reynolds different was knowing when not to shoot. That's the harder lesson. The Shadow Riders' defeat had far-reaching consequences. Blackjack Thorne's imprisonment marked the end of an era in the territories. Other gangs, hearing how Ghost Shot had systematically dismantled 30 armed men without killing any of them, began avoiding confrontations, choosing negotiation over violence. Man didn't just change Whisper Creek, Marshall Hawthorne observed during one of his regular visits. He changed how people think about justice. Stories spread about a lawman who could outshoot anyone but chose to wound rather than kill, made other gunfighters start questioning their own methods. Dr. Wright kept detailed records of Reynolds's precision during the battle, which became the subject of study by other frontier physicians. The control required was extraordinary, she wrote in her journal. Each wound precisely placed to disable without permanent damage. It wasn't just gunfighting. It was surgical precision with a Colt. The town itself became a symbol of a different kind of frontier justice. Merchants and families moved in, drawn by stories of a place where the law meant more than just who had the fastest gun. The saloon where Reynolds had first faced down Rattler Ross became a gathering place where visitors would share tales of the quiet rancher who'd become a legend. Young Tommy Chen, now apprenticed to Dr. Wright, often spoke of how that day had changed his understanding of strength. Used to think being tough meant knowing how to hurt people, he told newcomers. Mr. Reynolds showed us it's tougher knowing how not to. Isabella Ramirez expanded her store to serve the growing community, but she kept the bullet mark in her doorframe where Reynolds had made his first impossible shot against the thorns. It served as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come without bloodshed. The Silver Colts became almost mythical in their own right. Gunsmiths from as far as St. Louis would visit, hoping to examine the weapons that had disarmed 30 men with surgical precision. But Reynolds would just smile quietly and keep them holstered, understanding that it wasn't the guns that had made the legend. It was the man who chose how to use them. Catherine Morgan's telegraph office became a hub for stories spreading across the territories. Tales of ghost shots mercy reached even into Mexico, where some of the Warner clan survivors had fled years ago. Word came back that several had turned themselves in, inspired by stories of a man who'd chosen a different path. Revenge is easy, Reynolds would say when asked about his change of heart. Mercy's the harder road, but it leaves fewer ghosts to haunt you. The town's transformation became a model for others throughout the frontier. Law enforcement officials would visit, hoping to learn from Morrison how one town had turned from a target for outlaws into a beacon of civilization. The answer was always the same. It wasn't about force, but about choosing when not to use it. Reynolds himself remained largely unchanged by his legend's growth. He still worked his ranch with methodical precision, still made his weekly trips into town, still shared peppermint candies with children. But those who knew him best saw how the weight had lifted from his shoulders, how the haunted look had faded from his eyes. Thomas would be proud, Marshal Hawthorne told him one evening, as they watched the sunset paint Thunder Ridge. You've become the kind of lawman he always believed in. Reynolds just nodded, those storm-gray eyes reflecting the dying light. Took the long way around, he said softly, but finally learned what he tried to teach me. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you choose not to fight. The legacy of Ghost Shot Reynolds lived on not in notches on a gun or bodies in graves, but in a community transformed by the power of chosen mercy. The legend that had begun in blood and vengeance had evolved into something else entirely, a tale not of death but of life, not of destruction, but of preservation. As Whisper Creek grew and prospered, the quiet rancher with the silver Colts remained its guardian, a living reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to know when to spare it. The ghost of vengeance had become a spirit of justice, and the valley echoed not with gunfire, but with the gentle music of wind chimes singing songs of peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.